number of years ago, maybe 5, 6 years.
It's even more now.
More than that.
Yeah.
Years ago, he started an effort at the University of Maryland Policy Center, where he is involved, and they did a very excellent survey of Israelis and Palestinians, just to try to find out where actually the red lines are, where people might be willing to make compromises, and under what conditions, what they had to understand before they could do that. Jerome has now been doing more work in thinking on Jerusalem, and comes with us with a new proposal that kind of leapfrogs over the current morass, and that's what he's here to talk with us about today. And I've not really fully heard this idea, so I'm as interested as you are in finding out more of what he has to say.
Yeah, thanks, Corinne. Let me actually pick up on one or two things that Corinne said, because just on this issue of the date of our Jerusalem study, the date is interesting because it wasn't 5 or 6 years ago. 5 or 6 years ago would put it at 2002. The common wisdom was that Jerusalem for Israelis is essentially non-negotiable. And it's hard to remember now because we had these, in many ways Camp David was a success. It was billed as a failure, but if it hadn't been viewed as a one-stage thing, if it had been viewed as a series of summits, and that was just the first of it, and it had been planned in advance, there'd be a second and a third, and then you ask, well, what was accomplished at the first? And if what was accomplished at the first was that the Israeli Prime Minister put on the table as official Israeli policy some important compromises on Jerusalem, that would have been enough for a big breakthrough. And so that is part of what happened at Camp David. But so unnegotiable was Jerusalem viewed at that time that I remember after Camp David, meeting in Israel, a public meeting with one of the leaders of the Israeli peace movement, Yael Dayan, who is a daughter of Moshe Dayan and quite a tough character in her own, saying that one thing that she thanked Barak for was that now it made it possible for her to speak openly about what should be done on Jerusalem. And this is, when you pull back and you think about this, this is extraordinary. This is the Israeli peace movement needing the Israeli prime minister to act first before they could speak openly about the necessity of dividing Jerusalem. Just tells you, what kind of a hold mythology about the non-negotiability of Jerusalem and what counted as political suicide had on people's minds. And we couldn't understand this years before. That is, we couldn't understand why it should be the case that Jerusalem was so non-negotiable. Parts of it, perhaps, but Jerusalem was a very strange mixture of many things. And one of the things that people don't understand is that what we call Jerusalem today is, it's West Jerusalem and East Jerusalem, but what we call East Jerusalem isn't something that has some historic standing. It's not, East Jerusalem today is not the East Jerusalem that was under Jordanian control from 49 to 67, and then that was liberated. That's only 10% of what we call East Jerusalem today. After Israel conquered the West Bank, it redrew the boundaries of East Jerusalem and multiplied tenfold the area that is defined as the municipality of Jerusalem. 90% of what's called East Jerusalem were West Bank territories and villages until after the 67 war. So it's got no historical relationship to Jerusalem at all. And in fact, there's a refugee camp inside of East Jerusalem because it was there, and they scooped it up as well as with Arab villages. So it was incomprehensible on some level, and part of it was our belief that Israelis themselves don't even know what is Jerusalem. And it turned out that all of that was true. And so we got funding, and we did a study that was, among other things, it was an investigation of what do Israelis and Palestinians really mean by Jerusalem, and what do they care about. And then one of the things that we wanted to do is to map the areas of Israeli concern over the areas of Palestinian concern, and to see whether or not the top priorities for Jerusalem as to what Jerusalem was were the same. If they were the same, and also if there wasn't any prioritization inside of it, then yeah, maybe it would be non-negotiable. And one of the things that we found is that when you mapped, and I literally mean map, I mean I'm actually imposing like two maps, one of which showed, let's say through colors, the areas of the highest priority for Israelis, and the other being the highest priorities for Palestinians. It turned out that there was only one part of the map in which the highest priorities actually overlapped, and they were the same. And that was the Old City. That was the walled city. And that constituted 1% of Jerusalem. 99% of Jerusalem was vastly more important to one side than the other. And that depended basically on who lived there. And basically it turned out that what was really important to Israelis was where Israelis live, and what was really important to Palestinians was where Palestinians lived. And we found with respect to the Old City, amazingly, that even that principle continued inside the Old City. That if you disaggregated the Old City, that the Arab quarters of the Old City were of vastly more importance to Palestinians than they were to Israelis. And for Israelis, it was the Jewish quarter that was most important. So it wasn't even, as it were, 1% of Jerusalem turned out to be of staggering importance to both peoples. It turned out that there was only one spot in Jerusalem that was of staggering importance to both people. And it was a small area inside the Old City called the Temple Mount. And that was it. So, I mean, what we did, in many ways, we did the most detailed studies that had been done, and in fact, they haven't been duplicated. And our research was actually, it began in 95, and I think it completed in 97, and Rabin was assassinated in between. But what our methodology was to disaggregate the Jerusalem question. Because if you asked anybody, are you prepared to negotiate about Jerusalem, everybody said no. But you started asking them about, well, are you prepared to negotiate about these neighborhoods? Or we even asked them a question put this way. He said, asking Israelis, he said, in order to have a more Jewish Jerusalem, would you be prepared to redefine the boundaries of Jerusalem, to exclude from Jerusalem certain areas that today are exclusively Palestinian in residence? We said something, I forgot the exact number, but it might have been like 54% of Israeli public said in 1996, yes, right? Well, that's what we mean by dividing Jerusalem. Well, this got a lot of attention. It was actually it was a major article in the Washington Post, but it was covered in a lot of places. And it was tremendously important because I think that it provided the underpinning. We did briefings of the Palestinian and Israeli leadership and so on. It provided the underpinnings, I think, for the compromises that Barak was willing to make. He didn't go into, he was a careful person and too cautious in many ways. And he did not go into Camp David and a willingness to compromise on Jerusalem without an understanding of what the Israeli public really would accept and would not accept. And the importance of this, other than the substance of Jerusalem, to me, in any event, is a lesson about not relying so much on the experts and on the policy community, and a willingness for anybody to think about things in a fresh way, and to if you have the opportunity to pursue them. And it could be any of a variety of ideas that anybody, in fact, might have an opportunity to pursue. And my basic view is that anybody can make a big difference if you have a good idea and pursue it. It was actually published as a book in the summer. This is the book. It's called Negotiating Jerusalem. That came out in the summer of 2000. Which was the time of Camp David. But it was available, and in fact, some of this was in President Carter's briefing materials for Camp David. At any rate, the other thing that Corinne mentioned was this Declaration of Independence. And that's enormously important. I'm planning to get to that at the end of what I'm going to say here. We're approaching the 20th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was November 15th, 1988. And it was a month later that the PLO met the American conditions, for opening discussions, negotiations with the PLO in December of '88. That really opened up the window of opportunity that 5 years later led to Yasser Arafat and Rabin shaking hands on the White House lawn. In my mind, the real opportunity diplomatically for resolving the conflict began in November of '88, and I'll get to it later, with the Declaration of Independence. It was in the Declaration of Independence, but for the first time, that the PLO reversed its position on the partition resolution of 1947, which provided for creating two states, one Arab and one Jewish. In fact, in the declaration itself, they quoted that phrase, and largely ignored to this day, but they quoted that phrase from the UN Resolution 181 that had provided for two states, and then there's a quote, one Arab and one Jewish. So the Palestinian Declaration of Independence, starting in '88, accepted that Israel was created as a Jewish state under international law. And to this day, that has not sunk in. It's not even hardly known. You could go in this town to Brookings, the Near East Institute, the State Department, the NSC, and talk to your experts there and ask them straight out question, did the Palestinians ever accept the legitimacy of Israel as under international law? It's not its moral right to have a Jewish state or be a state, but that under legitimate international law, it was created as a Jewish state. Did they ever say that it had a legal right to be a Jewish state, the Palestinians? And people will say, no, they never did that. In fact, I was told by an Israeli only a month ago who had a position. He was the head of some intelligence service in Israel. That one thing the Palestinians never did, they never accepted us as a Jewish state. And I said, they did. And he said, no, where, when, and so on. It was amazing. To this day, you'll find that your experts never bothered to read the Palestinian Declaration of Independence. And it strikes you as impossible. How can you not read the Declaration of Independence and claim to understand a national movement of a people that's your professional responsibility to study? But that is the state of the way things work. And we all buy too heavily into this image of expertise and understanding on the part of this political community and so on. Well, of course, we know it's minimal with respect to people who are elected political leaders, but it's also often minimal with respect to people who are professionals who have responsibility for these things. Now, part of about the context and the 20th anniversary is I think that we had a truly great and deep opportunity to end the conflict, to reach a point at which we would say the Israeli-Palestinian and the Israeli-Arab conflict is over. That opened in '88, and I do think it is closing. I really do. It's been open for a long time. And it may be that it doesn't mean that we'll be in relentless war thereafter. But deep resolution, it seems to me, will be off of the table in another year and a half or so. And one of the ways of thinking about that timing is, just as somebody said today, I think it was Raith Al-Omari, is that if we wait until the end of the Bush administration, which is the 18 months, then in fact we're really talking about waiting 3 years. If we're talking about waiting 3 years, then we're also talking, if it doesn't happen sooner, about the next Palestinian elections. In the next Palestinian elections, if there isn't real movement towards a two-state solution between now and then, I think it's reasonable to assume that Abu Mazen will be gone, either that he will not run again, and I don't think there is really going to be an adequate replacement for him, but even if he runs again, that he will be defeated by Hamas. Maybe Haniyeh will run for president next time. And there is this real prospect that then Hamas will control both the legislature and the executive branch of government. At that point, the idea that the PLO, which is not elected at all, remains the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, becomes unsustainable. At that point, basically, Hamas is the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people if they win both the legislative and the executive branch through elections. And while I think it would be possible, and it may be for some Israelis, there are some Israelis I think who would prefer that because there's a certain kind of limited kind of agreement that you might be able to make with Hamas, which is not that different from sort of the interim partial settlement that Ariel Sharon was interested in, which is, you let them have a Palestinian state in Gaza and some of the West Bank, and you don't deal with refugees, and you don't deal with Jerusalem, and you don't deal with the settlements, and the conflict is not over. But it just sort of stays in place, hopefully. It doesn't break out into warfare. But that's, I think, what we will have rather than an end of conflict possibility. I think end of conflict is very real and tremendously important, and we should not move towards the alternative of Hamas as the negotiating partner until, in fact, we've exhausted that possibility of making a deal through the PLO. Now, one of the amazing pieces, which is being ignored, I was talking before about professionals ignoring things, professionals not even understanding them, as well as the policy people, in the current context, is what the Palestinians have actually done in recent months. To put this in perspective, so we've got these radically two ideologies, between one represented by Hamas and one represented by Fatah, or the PLO, about the place of Israel, the place of a Jewish state in the Middle East, a willingness to end the conflict, and so forth. And then Hamas decides to enter the political system. And it participates in an election, and it succeeds in an enormous victory in the legislative election, and sets up the government, and now they have a unity government, and so on. But you've got then two entities in Palestinian government. And then you have a problem, which is who can commit for the Palestinian people? How do the Palestinian people reach a peace agreement with Israel? Who has to say yes? And you've got two-headed government, and it's not a make-believe problem. It's not something that was invented by the quartet as some sort of condition related to that has to be resolved. Not only do you have that problem, you've got essentially an emasculation of Abu Mazen as a negotiator, because he can't go there and negotiate with the Israelis and make, as it were, trade-offs, because the Israelis quite reasonably will not believe anything that he's offering as a trade-off, because he can't deliver, because he no longer can speak collectively for the Palestinians as a whole. So in many ways, the possibility of a negotiated solution is undermined by this political phenomenon, unless somehow or other the Palestinians get their act together and agree. Now, if you're going to get your act together, one way to do it is to say, well, look, the PLO can negotiate, as they always have, and that's the formal responsibility of them in any event. I mean, the PA wasn't supposed to negotiate. But you would say then, anything that they negotiate has to be submitted for referendum. And you could say, I mean, the United States has that process. Most countries do. So the executive negotiates, and the legislature ratifies treaties, right? 2/3 vote of the Senate, right? That's our process. That's why we didn't enter the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson couldn't get through the Senate, right? The treaty that he negotiated, and for us to do that. And then Abu Mazen would have to come back to the legislature with a treaty. Well, that would resolve the problem in formal terms, that there'd be a coherent framework for it. But if what Abu Mazen had to do was get a treaty through a Hamas-dominated legislature, even with a majority vote, it would still give Hamas a veto over any treaty agreement, which would enormously weaken him, if not totally disempower him, as a negotiator. Well, what the Palestinians have done is that they have agreed on a ratification process. And the ratification process, it's the agreement, first it was in the prisoners' document, and then it was picked up and it's in the Mecca agreement, which was essentially the platform of the unity government. And the ratification process that they've agreed on is that Abu Mazen, as head of the PLO and president of the PA, will negotiate And rather than his bringing it back to the legislature where Hamas would have a veto, he'll bring it to a referendum. And if it passes the referendum, then the treaty becomes the law of the land. Well, think about this for a second. What does this mean? Well, this is something that rather than disempowering Abu Mazen, in fact empowered him. It meant that he can go from his negotiations directly to the people. And anything that he can get approved by the people, Hamas has agreed it will abide by. Which means in some sense he's stronger than he was when Hamas was on the outside as a spoiler not committed to anything that Arafat signed in the first place. So we have in principle an enhancement of his powers. In addition to that, we've got Hamas agreeing that it will abide by it, which means that Hamas is saying that even if Abu Mazen agrees that the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is over, even if he agrees there are no further claims, even if he recognizes Israel as a Jewish state, Hamas will have to swallow that. Even if there's no return of Palestinian refugees, Hamas will swallow it so long as it's approved by a referendum. Which means that Hamas has opened the door for a process which not now, in other words, not now in advance of negotiations, is it making vast ideological changes. But it's agreed to a process which can commit it to vast ideological changes in the context of a full agreement down the road. Well, if you pull back and you say, what more could we have wanted from Hamas? What would have been, as it were, the ideal formulation once they entered government, that if we had come to them with a dream list of what is it we want them to do? What we would have said, I think, is agree to a process that allows Abu Mazen to negotiate, don't get in his way, and would you really be willing, let's say he took it to the people and got it approved, would you be willing to respect that? That would be our dream, as it were, approach to Hamas with a different ideology. And we would have thought it's impossible that they'd say yes to this, okay? Internally, not because they were asked from the outside, but internally, this is what they've agreed on, right? This is where we are today, right? In their unity government agreement, in fact, they had a commitment to pass a law that, in fact, will put in place this ratification by referendum process, which now is in the Mecca agreement, but it's not in law. And one of the things that the US and the EU should be, in fact, asking the Palestinians to do is follow through on your platform. In fact, I think it's the only piece of legislation they're committed to in the platform. It's just to say, do what you said you're going to do. And if you do it, we'll respond to that as a major step that it is, okay? Well, this is something that's hardly on the radar screen of policymakers, and I would say to some extent, we heard a little about it today, and I was very encouraged to hear people talking. Like Rafe mentioned it, and then Judith in her talk was talking a little bit about ratification by referendum, but a fuller appreciation actually about the stage of political development that the Palestinians actually move towards. I don't think we have. We're so taken by the fact that there's no economic development and that there have been reversals. The idea that, in fact, the Palestinians have gone through a very positive political development, with Hamas coming in from the outside, joining the political process, honest elections, unity government, ratification by referendum, and so on. These are major transformative steps that create opportunities for peace that weren't there before. At the same time, if nothing is made of this, I think that we're looking to a very different kind of thing, and Abu Mazen and the moderates will disappear from the scene. Because frankly, they've got very little to offer the Palestinians except success in the nationalist project, except bringing that Palestinian state into being. Now, the identified topic of this workshop was the idea of a breakthrough on the Temple Mount. What kind of breakthrough and how to move towards it. Let me talk for a second about the idea of a breakthrough. What are we talking about when we want a breakthrough? Well, it's basically something like this. We're looking for a breakthrough without even knowing what it is. We might ask the question, is it possible to do something big as a first step towards a comprehensive agreement, but to actually accomplish something big, that it's big enough that by doing that, in fact, it'll change a lot of other things. It'll open other doors. It'll change people's consciousness. There'll be hope, and also there'll be proof that certain kinds of things have been done, okay? Something that will actually convince, among other things, policymakers, even in the Bush administration, maybe it is possible to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That is, give them the image of success. And the success thing is very important. Part of what we've heard about, we've been talking about the Baker Commission stuff and so on today and so on, is all about the importance of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And, yes, of course, the fighting won't stop in Iraq and so on, but everybody has made the point, a number of people made the point, that every other issue that the United States deals with in the Middle East will be easier to deal with. Okay, so that's the important argument, okay, the importance argument, very important to resolve it. But if it's not possible to resolve it, it doesn't matter, right? And when a president comes in, one of the very first things, I remember Dan Kurtzer explaining this at a talk years ago, the very first thing that the president wants to know is, where should I allocate my time and energy, my presidential assets, right? Only so much of it, right? And what he wants to know, is, among other things, in answering that question, is not just importance, but where can I make a difference? Where can I succeed? Don't tell me to run up against a wall if it's an impossible wall to get through. Now, the lesson of Camp David that many people took away, and unfortunately Clinton reinforced this and Barack reinforced this and so on, is this narrative that the Palestinians aren't interested in resolving the conflict, or that it's too hard to do, and so on. And so part of it, the Bush administration came away with it, was don't make Clinton's mistake and attempt to do this. Well, that was bad enough. But remember that what Clinton was dealing with was Ehud Barak as prime minister. When Bush came in, or 2 weeks after Bush was inaugurated, Ariel Sharon was elected. And when Clinton came in, we were still living in the Oslo space. When Bush came in, we were already 3 or 4 months into the second Intifada. So Bush came in with the Al-Aqsa, right, Temple Mount, Intifada raging, and Ariel Sharon as prime minister. And so you did not have to be a neocon, you did not have to be some ostrich to tell Bush, you're trying to decide where to invest your time as president. You'll be wasting your presidential assets if you go after end of conflict in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You had an Intifada raging, you had Arafat in the fullness of his powers, and now you had Ariel Sharon as prime minister. And Sharon, I think, basically every day gave thanks insofar that he believed that Arafat was the reason that Camp David failed. He gave thanks to God for Arafat, because from his point of view, Barak was willing to give away the store. Simply willing to give away things that Sharon was not prepared to give away. I had Israelis much more moderate than Ariel Sharon at that time tell me there are things more important than peace, and there are things that you do not negotiate over. And if you have to give them up in negotiations, better to have to fight than to give them up. And he was talking about Jerusalem. And so the idea that everybody knows the terms of the end game and it's just how we get there, that's not true. When we say everybody knows the terms of the end game, those are people who their concept of everyone is, a very sharply circumscribed parameters. There are big, important players who know no such thing because they believe no such thing, because they'll accept no such thing. And Hamas is one of those players, and the right wing is another one of those players. And so that's part of the problem, okay? But Ariel Sharon died, and almost, no, he didn't die. Politically, he died, right. Ariel Sharon, first of all, Ariel Sharon changed. I actually believe that he went through a significant evolution, and he began the process, actually, which in many ways is the most important process, of breaking the back of the settler movement. While in many ways the unilateral evacuation from Gaza was a terrible mistake, it was of historic importance, and I think it'll turn out to be historic importance with respect to beginning to open the doors to ending the conflict. All one has to do is to go back to the whole idea of creating those facts on the ground, which was to make it impossible for anyone to give up those territories, to create a political reality that was irreversible. And we all remember, not all of us, but remember Miriam Ben-Venisti giving us in the 90s, telling us already that it was too late, that too many settlements had been built, that the idea of the two-state solution was already passé because they had created so many settlements, and you could not do it. Well, Sharon proved that you could reverse it, and Olmert and Kadima ran on the explicit platform, and this is unusual in Israel, to run on an explicit platform. And it's certainly unusual to run on an explicit platform and intend to follow through on it. But in doing so, Olmert came to power with a mandate clearer than Israeli prime ministers typically have to evacuate most of the settlers, or not settlers, but most of the settlements, rather, about 80% could be contained within a very small area of the West Bank along the Green Line. But to evacuate most of the settlements from the West Bank, most of them being quite small, and to do that unilaterally, to do that, in other words, without even getting anything in exchange from the Palestinians. So there were real possibilities. The war in Lebanon completely undermined the momentum for that, and I don't know where we're going to go today. But Olmert is still there. I think that if Kadima doesn't have a political alternative that somehow fits with the desire of the Israeli public to move forward, then it's nothing, and it'll disappear from the political scene in the next Israeli elections. And Abu Mazen is there, and the Palestinians have this new process. So it is possible to do something within this period. And the other part of it is, as is talked about today, is the Arab Peace Initiative, which supposedly is what Israelis have been waiting for since Israel was created. At the time of the 1967 war, Moshe Dayan said, after they took the territories, that he's waiting for the phone to ring. And basically, he was waiting for an Arab peace offer. And the idea was that these territories, both Sinai and West Bank and so on, would be traded for peace, land for peace, which is what got built into 242 in 1967. And the question is, would they ever accept it, right? Well, the PLO accepted it in 1988. In 2002, we had the first iteration of the Arab Peace Initiative, and then we had a repeat of it just recently. And we now have something that says, it talks about viewing the Israeli-Arab conflict as ended, uses that phrase. And so, and it still isn't making the difference that it should, but it's getting more attention than it had in the past. And one of the things that we can do, among other things, is to elevate the importance of that, the historic importance of it. And that has helped bring us back. Talking about ending it, and a couple of other things that are going on, talking about the political horizon, has brought final status issues back into the equation. So my question is it possible to achieve something that is enough of a success, when we're talking about a breakthrough issue, with respect to final status issues, that one can believe, in fact, that maybe if we negotiate or in some other way, such as, the United States putting a peace treaty on the table, bringing them together and saying, try to improve it for 90 days, but after 90 days, improved or not, I expect you to put this to a referendum of your two peoples. That would be one approach that circumvents standard bilateral negotiations, emphasizes the role of the international community, emphasizes the role of the people, builds peace on three legs, right? The governments, the people, and the international community, rather than where it is right now, which is just on the governments. Okay? That would be, I call it a referendum-based peace process. That would be one approach. Another approach the international community could do is to go back to the Security Council and revisit 242, which was important in its day, but now provides no guidance for the fundamental issues that need to be dealt with in the Congress. We recognize that we've got weak leaders. Moderates, at least on both sides, do know what the terms of an agreement would have to be, some variant of the Clinton parameters, spelled out in Geneva and Taba and so on. We could go to the UN and have the Security Council, in fact, give hard truths to both Israeli and Palestinian people, but ones that are largely non-controversial inside that moderate circle, and by doing so, relieve weak leaders of the burden of having to make political concessions that they are too weak to make. Take the burden of heavy lifting off of their shoulders by imposing on them a solution. And what that truth would be, we would say to the Israelis, you have to withdraw from the equivalent of 100% of the West Bank and Gaza. It doesn't have to be exactly the green line, but with land swaps, it's got to equal that. Some variant, basically, of the Arab interpretation of 242. And that's just the way it is. And this is the Security Council's interpretation of 242. This is what we mean by it today. And it would say that to the Palestinians, with respect to the refugee issue, which was just referred to as the refugee issue in 242, it would say to them that refugees have a right to compensation. Israel is going to have to cough up a lot of that. The international community will help. But it is not practicable to implement a Palestinian right of return to Israel per se. Go back to 194, the General Assembly resolution that the Palestinians view as having provided a legal right in international law to return. It doesn't actually say a right of return, but it does talk about, say that the Palestinian refugees should be allowed to return to their homes, but it says at the earliest practicable date. It uses that phrase. Okay? Well, maybe it was practicable sometime around 1948. Today, it is not practicable. And the Security Council could say so and should say so in the same breath that it tells Israel that it's got to give up those territories. And then it could say something about Jerusalem, which is not mentioned in 242. And it could say Jerusalem is part of the territories that are described in 242, but it's a special case. Jerusalem was not intended to be part of the Palestinian state, not even East Jerusalem was, because West Jerusalem wasn't supposed to be part of the Israeli state. If we go back to the petition resolution, Jerusalem was going to be in what they call the corpus separatum, a separate international sphere, right? And what happened in the 48 war is that Israel conquered part of it, and Jordan, which wasn't supposed to be a player in this at all, conquered other parts of it, including the Old City. But so Jerusalem's got a different kind of status, and the Security Council could simply say that while we're not going to have a corpus separatum, maybe we will for parts of it, but while that's not the general solution, neither state will have exclusive sovereignty over Jerusalem. And if it said those three things as international law, 100% equivalent on the territory, refugee compensation, but not practicable to go back inside of Israel, and no exclusive sovereignty over Jerusalem, right? Laid that down. If the United States supported that, that would pass in the Security Council today. And we would have a different framework, and that could happen tomorrow if we had a willingness on the part of the government to do that. And it would be applauded by moderates all over, and it would transform the possibilities because it would lay out basically the core framework. Okay. I don't think that that's going to happen, but it's worth talking about that. It's not impossible. It certainly is in American interest to do it. What I'm talking about here, at any rate, is a somewhat different approach, but it could come from the international community also, and it focuses on the Temple Mount. And the question is, why the Temple Mount as a breakthrough place? If we're looking for a place to have a breakthrough, why the Temple Mount? Standard view is that the Temple Mount, and I was telling you before, that is right the place of extreme attachment inside of Jerusalem for the two. The standard view of the conflict is, well, you've got the conflict is over land, and then Jerusalem is the hardest part of the land that everybody, so Jerusalem is the hardest nut inside the larger nut, and then inside of that is the old city, and then inside of the old city is, this diamond-hardened thing called the Temple Mount. So if you wanted to look at the hardest possible issue that there is to resolve, that's the Temple Mount. So why is the Temple Mount going to be a breakthrough issue? Well, I think that view is wrong, actually. I think the Temple Mount is the most volatile issue, in some sense, in the conflict, but not the hardest issue to resolve. It's the most volatile issue in the conflict in some ways. Remember the Temple Mount tunnel that Netanyahu opened one end of that set off violence when he was prime minister, rioting, and many people were killed. Just this thing of, and it was actually a tunnel that just connected the Jewish quarter and it wasn't a tunnel under the Temple Mount. It connected the Jewish quarter, the Palestinian quarter, but it was so, filled with symbolism, and people, nobody even knew what it was. The Al-Aqsa Intifada that we're in now, Al-Aqsa being one of the mosques on the Temple Mount now, the Intifada is supposedly around that. It was triggered by Ariel Sharon's decision to go up onto the Temple Mount, right? So I think actually the riots in the 20s were triggered by action having to do with the Temple Mount. So the Temple Mount certainly is volatile. But is it the hardest issue to resolve? Well, think for a second about other issues of the conflict. Think about settlements, okay? What we're talking about is, let's say Israel keeps 5% of the land or 3% of the land and 75% of the settlers. We're talking about evacuating 50,000 people, right? We might be talking about 100 or 100 plus settlements that have to be evacuated. We're talking about jobs. We're talking about resettlement for those people, vast amounts of money just to compensate them for that. And we're talking about something that many of them will be prepared to fight over, or at least they say that they are, and so on. So pulling those people out of the West Bank involves transformations on the ground that are enormous. Think about the refugee problem. We're talking about literally millions of people who have refugee status. We're talking about Palestinians, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, in refugee camps in the territories, and so on. We're talking about their housing, about their citizenship, and so on, and their aspirations. So that issue has got major transformative stuff that has to happen in real people, vast, vast projects of change and money and mobilization and so on. And then think about borders and security issues, okay? We're talking about dealing with the issue of demilitarization. Palestinian state having borders, yet preventing importation of weapons coming in. How do you prevent, there being a threat to Ben Gurion Airport from missiles that are located in the West Bank? How do you deal with Israeli bases? How do you deal with early warning systems? How do you deal with Israel's relationship with a possible change in who Iraq is and the fear of an Iraqi army or Syrian armies coming in? So you're talking about, or overflight rights of the Israeli Air Force, which practices over the West Bank and so on. So you're talking about things which, have enormous complexity and transformation that has to be dealt with. What are we talking about with the Temple Mount? Okay? Well, think about it. The Temple Mount, there's already an administrative agreement on there. In many ways, the Temple Mount works as it is today, right? In the 67 war, because the Temple Mount was understood to be so volatile, it was decided to leave the administration in the hands of the Muslim religious authorities, because the Temple Mount was and is an active site of Muslim worship. It's not an active site of Jewish worship for the last 2,000 years, right? Since we had the temple up there, right? But there have been mosques that have been the place of Arab worship for centuries and centuries, okay? So the decision was to leave it in their hands, the day-to-day administration of it. And then the Israeli army, which has exercised and insists on some residual security responsibility, but isn't the first line of that. But one of the roles that it plays is it limits access to the Temple Mount from troublemakers in Israel. So you've got these groups, that want to go up there. You've got people who wanted to blow up the Temple Mount. Israel works very hard to prevent, and there were attempts made, right, both Israelis and non-Israelis, to blow up the mosques. So the Shin Bet is actively, on a daily basis, engaged in the effort to protect the Temple Mount from that. And Israeli soldiers are stationed there, and it will not allow certain groups, it will allow individuals to go up on the Temple Mount, but they're not allowed to form groups that will prey on the Temple Mount. Okay? So Israel provides a role in providing just outside for this. And there are limitations on excavation and what can be done. There's tension over that and so on. But there's basically an existing framework that's in place for day-to-day administration of the Temple Mount. So what is the Temple Mount issue, right? The Temple Mount issue is symbolic. It's just symbolism. That's what it's all about. And it's about really one piece, one issue, because it's not basically, is the Al-Aqsa Mosque going to be a synagogue or a mosque? That's not the struggle. And except for people on the real fringe, there is no movement to rebuild the temple on the Mount. One of the things that's in place, and hopefully will remain in place, is that the mainstream religious authorities inside of Israel forbid Jews from going up on the Temple Mount. The Jews who go up on the Temple Mount today are either people who are outside the mainstream religiously or are not religious. But you don't find Orthodox Jews going up onto the Temple Mount because it's the ruling of the rabbis that you're not supposed to go up there because we don't know where the Holy of Holies was. And the Holy of Holies is a place that you're not allowed to transgress into. So for religious reasons, you're kept off of that. So that's part of what holds the Temple Mount issue in place and made it possible to not, in 67, have Israel put up synagogues on the Temple Mount and so on. So you don't have a current struggle over, even the symbolic struggle is not over we want a synagogue and to replace the mosque. It's about sovereignty, which isn't, by the way, the issue of, in some sense people say, whose is it? It's not exactly whose is it, because that's in many ways the issue of property. It's actually whose country is it in? That's what the sovereignty issue is about. It could be even inside of the other guy's country and belong to us, right? But primarily it's about that, which is this oddness. And that issue only comes up actually because of where the Green Line is, right? It was around the old city, so it had been under Jordanian control. If in fact Jerusalem had been somewhere else, or the Temple Mount had been somewhere else, it would still emerge as, mosques, location of the temple, where Isaac was supposedly sacrificed, where Muhammad went to heaven, and so on. But the issue of whose country it is wouldn't arise. Whose country is it in is actually the issue of sovereignty that we're stuck with right now. But in some ways, on some level, that isn't even the deepest issue. For religious people, it isn't and shouldn't be the deepest issue. Whose country is it in? It's really to whose faith does it belong? And on that, they're not actively engaged because of this rabbinic ruling. So what I'm saying is that compared to a lot of other issues, in fact, the Temple Mount is, from some perspective, is an astonishingly easy issue because we have an administrative framework in place, and it could be resolved if, in fact, we could come up with a way to deal with a symbolic thing. And symbolic things, one thing that's interesting is that, it could be resolved symbolically, in fact, in a very short period of time. That is, by a decision to take a certain kind of approach with respect to sovereignty. Okay? Now, the approach that I'm advocating is not something that I thought up. It's something that comes from the late King Hussein of Jordan, which is the sovereignty belongs to God approach to the Temple Mount. You remember that the King Hussein views himself, his family, his legitimacy, today it's true of King Abdullah, as descendants from the Prophet and having, among other things, a responsibility for the oversight, care, protection, and so on of Muslim holy places. And that was his view about Jordan's responsibility or Hashemite responsibility towards the Temple Mount. And he's engaged in this little competition about it and so on. But at any rate, the proposal that he put forward, right, for under his hat, basically, as descendant of the Prophet, right, was that the sovereignty issue should be taken out of the political context. And you should say that sovereignty belongs to God. Now, what does this mean? What is the idea of doing this? The main idea of doing this is that this is a way of defusing the symbolic issue that's there, which is the political sovereignty. It's by saying that sovereignty belongs to God that you can avoid having to say, no, sovereignty belongs to Israel, or sovereignty belongs to the Palestinian state. In other words, it's an alternative to that debate. If you can get an alternative to that debate, you've solved the symbolic issue. And if you just have the administrative issue, you've solved the Temple Mount issue. So it's a way of getting at, in many ways, the heart of the issue. which is to introduce that symbolism. Now, there are other ways of doing it. You could say, well, put it under international control. Or you could say, just agree to disagree. Right? But if you agree to disagree without an alternative symbolism, then the administrative things take on a very different kind of role. Then every sort of administrative issue becomes, as it were, a representation of sovereignty. And so you'll end up intensifying that. But if you introduce a new symbolism, the symbolism of God having sovereignty, then, in fact, you can keep the administrative issues where they are because they don't represent steps towards political sovereignty. So it's a better way of doing it from my point of view. Now, there are two ways of interpreting sovereignty belongs to God. There's what I call weak sovereignty belongs to God, and there's strong sovereignty belongs to God. Strong sovereignty belongs to God would be saying the concept of political sovereignty is no longer a legitimate concept. And so then what we're asking Israel to do is to relinquish its present claim of political sovereignty over the Temple Mount. Israel believes that it is sovereign over the Temple Mount today. And you'd be asking the future state of Palestine to abandon any future claim of political sovereignty. So that would be strong sovereignty belongs to God. Weak sovereignty belongs to God. Allows both sides to maintain, if asked, their claim that they've got sovereignty over the Temple Mount. But it's an agreement, basically, that not to seek recognition of that claim from the other side. So Israel can say sovereignty belongs to God. The Palestinians can say sovereignty belongs to God. And when asked, when we have your own, let's say Palestinians have their state, the Israelis have their state, and then each one is asked, well, does Israel have sovereignty belong over the Temple Mount? If they want, an Israeli could say, well, we do have political sovereignty over the Temple Mount. And the Palestinians can say, well, we do have political sovereignty over the Temple Mount. But we're not pushing the issue with the Israelis because we both agreed that sovereignty belongs to God. And we've got an administrative framework here that deals with all the concrete issues that come up between us, in addition to an adjudicative mechanism for dealing with conflicts, which could be an international role to resolve things. So it's a way in which they can diffuse the issue of political sovereignty. That no longer represents anything by saying that there's divine sovereignty over it. And so it's, in a sense, it sounds weaker, but actually I think it's more feasible, and I think I actually think it's quite doable, and that's what I want to turn to now. How doable is this? How make-believe is this? Okay. Well, first of all, let's go through different kind of actors and their relationship to it. First of all, the Arab states. Well, as I've said, this is a Jordanian idea, and it's a Jordanian idea that came out of Hussein's identity, not as king of Jordan per se, but as someone whose legitimacy is Islamic and has a specific role in relationship to the Temple Mount. Okay. Egypt. I had.
Just got about 5 or 6 minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was misreading the clock here. Okay, I'll go quickly. The Egyptians after Camp David played a role in trying to convince the Palestinians of this. So there's Egyptian support for this. The U.S. played a role. The U.S. has supported this in the past. The Barak government agreed to this if the Palestinians would agree to it. Okay. Arafat personally ridiculed it, but many other Palestinians found it a way to go, and my belief is that Abu Mazen would accept it. Okay. Key thing which I want to show you here. I'll pass this out. This is one page from my book. It shows one copy here. This was about how the Israeli and the Palestinian publics relate to this proposal. And take a look at this this one table here that I've called 4.8. Okay, now this was over holy sites. The question is slightly different, but it includes. The question was: there's a proposal that each side should stop arguing about sovereignty over holy sites in Jerusalem and agree that ultimate sovereignty belongs to God. Is this proposal acceptable to you? National means the total national survey. That means all the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And those who said yes and those who said definitely yes, the first two columns, you bring that together, you've got 64% of the Palestinian public in the 1990s saying yes to this. As far as I know, no one has ever duplicated these questions, okay? So you've got 64% opposed, in favor, 36% opposed. Very clear, solid support. This is much more support than you get from most proposals. Pardon?
Got 2 minutes yet for taping.
Okay. If we go down here to Islamists, 2 lines down, the support increases. And as those people who identify with Hamas, the support increases to 77%. And if you go down here to the very religious, it actually increases to 88% of Palestinians. So you have extremely high support on the Palestinian side that's stronger among Hamas supporters than it is among non-Hamas, and strongest among the religious. On the Israeli side, there's old data over here that shows that we did not get a majority on the Israeli side. We only got 35% in favor of it. We redid polling questions on this in 2005 on the Israeli side, and we found that the public was giving us a very different response that basically reversed these numbers. Found 36%, 33% opposed, and 55% in favor on the Israeli side. So I think the support that you can have on both sides, and the support on the Israeli side, by the way, was stronger among the most highly religious. Now, the last thing I want to say is about sovereignty belongs to God thing, is that what it does is it pulls consciousness away from the conflict of civilizations. One of the first things that people say who operate either out of ignorance or cynicism is, oh yeah, sovereignty belongs to God. Who's God? Which God? As if we're talking about a conflict between Hindus and Christians or something of this sort. There's a very strong consciousness. It's probably strongest among Muslims, second maybe among Christians, and third among Jews. But nonetheless, there's a general awareness that all of these people believe that they all believe in the same God. There's an awareness that when the Palestinians or the Muslims view as prophets the Israelite prophets, that Abraham is, and Moses and Joseph and Jacob are prophets in Islam. So it pulls us away from this idea that this is a war of civilizations, or at any rate of civilizations who are strangers to each other, and pulls us in the direction of another vision, which is cousinship. And I want to end here by going back to the Declaration of Independence, because part of what this does is it reinforces something that we have in '88 and can be the basis for a future Palestinian state. I just want to call your attention to 2 or 3 things in the Declaration. The Palestinian Declaration of Independence opens with the following phrase: Palestine, the land of the 3 monotheistic faiths. Think about that for a second. Okay. If you're writing a Declaration of Independence for the Palestinian national movement, that you would start by calling it the land of the 3 faiths. And then it goes on, and 2 paragraphs later, it says this. It says, nourished by an unfolding series of civilizations and cultures, inspired by a heritage rich in variety and kind, the Palestinian people, Arab people, added to its stature by consolidating a union between itself and its patrimonial land. And then it says, the call went out from temple, church, and mosque, that to praise the Creator, to celebrate compassion and peace, was indeed the message of Palestine. Okay? This is the Palestinian Declaration of Independence. Temple, mosque, and church. And then finally, later on, when they talk about the details of the Palestinian state that they are projecting, they're telling us about a state which will be an Arab Palestinian state. Dominant population are Muslims, but not the only. But they locate this state within the Western tradition. Okay? And they tell us the state of Palestine is the state of the Palestinians wherever we will be, And then it goes on to say that it will be safeguarded, they'll safeguard their political and religious convictions, their human dignity, by means of parliamentary democratic system of governance, based on freedom of expression and freedom to form parties. The rights of the minorities will duly be respected by the majority, as minorities must abide by the decision of the majority. Governance will be based on principles of social justice, equality, non-discrimination in public rights of men and women on grounds of race, religion, color, sex, and the aegis of the Constitution, which ensures the rule of law from an independent judiciary. Thus shall these principles allow no departure from Palestine's age-old spiritual and civilizational heritage of tolerance and religious coexistence. Okay? So this was and remains the promise of the Palestinian national movement under the PLO for a state that would create for the first time in the Arab world essentially a democratic, secular state grounded in the ideas of the French and American revolutions that would bridge the idea of a conflict of civilizations within this framework of the three monotheistic faiths.